Good morning again to you, friends, on this Martin Luther King Sunday. Today, we continue further in the season of Epiphany, this time to reflect on manifestation and identity and that spiritual essence called soul. Today, we continue to consider what caring for that essence looks like in a time such as this, as we look specifically at the power to be found in holding our history with intention. First, though, I just have to say it, therapists sometimes ask some really weird questions, don't they? If you've ever been to therapy, then you know what I'm talking about. If this feeling had a color, a therapist might suggest, then what would it be? Another therapist might ask, what happens in your body when you say that out loud? Probably the weirdest therapist question I've ever been asked is, how old do you feel right now? If you're like I was, then when you hear this question, your first thought is, what? On its face, it's a question that seems easy to dismiss because either the answer is so obvious it feels silly to even ask, or because the question is so strange it feels silly to even answer. But in fact, if you take it seriously, that question, like so many weird therapist questions, can reveal unexpected insights. When we're at the peak of emotional intensity, incredible anger or deep fear or searing sadness, asking how old we feel points us to the reality that sometimes things in our history are so significant that they really never stop shaping our present. A trauma you sustained as an 8-year-old has the potential to swell back up and overcome your 40-year-old self. A hurt you experienced as a 13-year-old might still sometimes take control of your consciousness at 75. To ask how old we feel in the midst of our pain is to take us back to a time in our past that continues to echo into our present. And what we discover in that voyage is information that, if we let it, can help us to have more agency in shaping our future. This is partly why I think so many of us keep asking this question of the times we're in. We don't directly say it, but as we compare this time to some former time, maybe what we're really saying is, based on what I know, our society feels this old to me right now. For a lot of people, this time feels like the age of Nazi Germany, when angry and discouraged white folks decided that the elites and the minorities were to blame for all of their problems. For some people, this time feels like the age that led to the United States Civil War, a time when this country felt split into separate and diametrically opposed realities that eventually attacked each other. For still others, this age feels like the 1960s, a time in which boundaries were dissolving and power was shifting, and as a result, those who were used to holding power decided to tighten their grip on everybody else. This kind of comparison, though, isn't a new thing. People routinely look at their own time and draw connections between the past and their present. This was a favorite analytical and rhetorical strategy, in fact, for no one other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He observed the tyrannical, oppressive, and authoritarian realities of his time. He studied its brutal strategies and its violent tactics, and he analogized and compared and claimed that in his time, America felt most like the age of the Israelites at various junctures in the Holy Bible. You might think, well, of course he made biblical comparisons. He was a preacher, after all. Fair enough. However, in his activism, Dr. King didn't just draw quotes from the Bible to bolster his own points. Time and time again, he looked at the stories and the histories and the context of the Bible, and he pointed to how the realities described there could guide folks here. He saw in the Israelites an ancient people who had experienced horrific oppression on the basis of their ethnicity, and he read in their history example after example of how human beings can experience the horrors of tyranny and meet those horrors with resolve, with hope, and with transformative action. The Bible acted for Dr. King not only as a source of religious resolve. Scripture offered also a human history of how people can survive the grip of authoritarian governments and oppressive regimes. And as it happens, the same was true for the Israelites themselves. The book of Deuteronomy is traditionally considered one of the 5 books of Moses. According to tradition, then, Moses wrote the book himself. However, based on a combination of archaeological evidence and textual analysis, most scholars, be they Jewish, Christian, or atheist, all agree that Deuteronomy is more likely a book that was composed over centuries. For much of that history, the Israelites faced exile, oppression, and the risk of losing their identity as believers in the God of their ancestors. The Assyrians controlled and conquered them. Then the Babylonians did the same, and then so too did the Persians. And all the while, in oppressive context after oppressive context, the Israelites had to face the same question. How do we hold on to our principles? How do we remain who we are? How do we refrain from becoming like the people who are oppressing us? Those kinds of questions feel familiar to anybody here? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 20 through 25 emerges to lend us an answer. You can follow along in your bulletin. It reads, "When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. God brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that was promised on oath to our ancestor. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to approach the Lord our God with awe for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. If we diligently observe this entire commandment before the Lord our God, as commanded, we will be in the right." In the midst of incredible pressures to bow down and become like their oppressors, in the face of the temptation to just give up and to give in to the horrors of the status quo, amidst all the ways that the authorities tried to convince them to accept and to submit, the book of Deuteronomy calls the Israelites to remember. Remember the past. Recall what our people have already survived. Reconnect with what worked then and hold fast to the promises of the God who was, who is, and who will outlast every pharaoh, king, and president. Remember your history. Know where you come from and remain resolute in the practices, the religious decrees and statutes in the case of Deuteronomy that have carried us all this way. The book of Deuteronomy says, all that stuff we do, all those practices we observe, all those guidelines that shape our lives, at some point your children will ask you, why? Why do we do all that stuff? And when that happens, the book of Deuteronomy says, tell them our history. In the time of Dr. King, as he and Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin and Medgar Evers and so many others were teaching the merits of nonviolence, there were probably people who were asking, why? Why should we stand there while they spit in our faces? Why should we let them beat us with batons and spray us with hoses and attack us with dogs? Why? And just as the Israelites were called to do, Dr. King shared history. He reminded the people in those trainings that creating a different world starts with how we create. He reminded those people that no end justifies every means, but in fact, the means create the end. He reminded his listeners through the voices of ancient prophets like Amos and Isaiah that adopting the tactics of violence and aggression is to become like their oppressors and in effect acknowledge the superiority of that oppressive worldview. Why do we make change in this way? Dr. King rhetorically asked. Why do we use these counterintuitive and countercultural means? Well, it's because, as history shows, creating a whole new world requires we create in a very different way. In our own time, as people debate the merits of nonviolent resistance, as people wonder why we should endeavor to love these enemies, as some folks determine that yelling threats and damning our adversaries are legitimate means of change-making, some of us are measuring these tactics against the brutality of our times and wondering, maybe the age for nonviolence is over. I mean, why wouldn't we give ourselves over to anger? Look at what they're doing. Why wouldn't we let aggression guide us? And in response, as was true for the Israelites, as was true for the civil rights workers, as has been true for so many, history echoes out to us. It calls us to consider the practices that have worked and to understand that it is when the present feels most intensely unique that history might be most instructive. It is when we are most in distress, most angry, most sad, most despairing. It is then that the past can ring through to us, not just as a way to diagnose the present, but also as a way to guide us into the future. This is true even of our personal lives, isn't it? So often is when we most need to remember our practices that we lose track of them. It's so often when we are most confused and most at sea that we forget the anchors that have kept us grounded. It is so often when our lives feel out of control, when we're in a rut or feeling desperate. It is so often in times when we're most likely to feel that all too familiar craving for a drink or a drug or some old habit. It is then so often that we fall out of our rhythm of going to meetings. And so often when we start to feel down, when it starts to get harder and harder to get out of bed, it is so often then that we take our meds less and less. It is so often when the world feels wild, when things get busy and demands get deeper, that we fall off our meditation practice or our sleep routine or our general rhythms of self-care. It is so often in these moments when it feels that we are most likely to get sucked all the way into the pressures of the present. That's when the voice of Deuteronomy rings out to us and says, remember your history. Remember your practices. Remember why you do all the things you do. It is for your lasting good. It's to keep you alive. The book of Deuteronomy asks us all, every moment in which we feel pressure and stress, what was it that brought you out of the land of Pharaoh? What was it that brought you out of that other time, that other age? And the book of Deuteronomy points us not only to a history of God, but also to a history of practices that have sustained our relationship with God. It was all that nonviolent training. It was all that prayer. It was all those 12-step meetings. It was all that meditation. It was all those weeks we cleaned our houses despite really not wanting to. It was all those nights you did get 8 hours of sleep. It was all those mornings you did remember to take your meds. It was all those times you called to check on your friends. It was all those times you let your friends call and check on you. It was all that volunteering and all those protests and all those marchers. It was all that effort you took to love and to remain connected to yourself and to your people and to your God. That's what has and what can continue to keep you alive. In a time such as this, friends, in moments of incredible stress and profound pain, that weird therapist question, "How old do you feel?" is going to point each of us to different places, because this time feels different to each of us based on our own experience of it. The more urgent question for us then, I believe, is this: what has helped us survive up to now? What strengths will help carry us through? What practices, what commitments, what disciplines might we hold on to from our history so that we might craft a more peaceful, a more liberated, a more love-infused future? As you consider your answers to these questions, I invite you to remember, echoing the words from Deuteronomy, that the power and love called God brought us out from Egypt. As you reflect on your history, I invite you to remember that there was a power and love that brought us out from the Civil War. I invite you to recall that a power and love helped us rebuild after the fall of Nazi Germany. I hope we don't forget the power and love that helped this country pass civil rights legislation in the 1960s. And I likewise call upon you, friends, not to forget the power and love that brought you out from that divorce, that carries you on through that addiction, that held you tight in that hospital bed, that is seeing you through that grief. I invite us all to remember the power and love that brought us out from under this Pharaoh or that one, be he political or personal. And in remembering, I invite you to let your soul be nurtured, knowing that God brought us out from that time in order to bring us into this time. And God will continue to do exactly that again and again and again. May it be so, and amen. We now worship God as we present our offering.